Negotiations as a confirmation of strength. The December 18th episode of the 60 Minutes program constructs a holistic interpretation of the current diplomatic process around Ukraine, in which negotiations between Moscow and Washington are not viewed as a search for compromise, but rather as a tool for consolidating the existing balance of power. The program's central idea is that the outcome of the conflict is essentially predetermined, and diplomacy merely formalizes the results achieved through military and strategic pressure. 1. Exclusivity of dialogue. The United States and Russia as the only actors. One of the key conceptual frameworks of the program is the exclusion of Europe from the real participants in the negotiation process. A possible meeting in Miami between Russian and American representatives is presented as confirmation that Washington and Moscow are the only actors capable of making decisions. In this logic, Europe is not simply secondary, but fundamentally devoid of agency. It observes across the Atlantic, comments, puts forward declarative initiatives, but does not influence the outcome. Ukraine, in turn, is presented as an object of pressure and negotiations, but not as an equal party. Thus, the conflict is conceptualized as a grand bargain between great powers, in which all other participants play supporting roles. He was far less kind to European leaders, calling them little pigs. However, sooner or later, he declared, they too will be ready for dialogue. Putin rejects any territorial concessions and backs up his statements with actions on the battlefield, reports SNN. Reuters broadcasts a clear warning. Moscow will continue its offensive if the Europeans break off the negotiations. Putin predicts that the European pigs who support Ukraine will lose power, writes the Financial Times. Pressure breeds counter-pressure. The Kremlin leader responds sharply. These European pigs, he declared, have joined the US administration under Joe Biden. In order to demand that Russia regain what was lost throughout history, all these attempts, he said, have completely failed. Everyone believed that they would destroy and dismantle Russia in a short period of time. And the European swine immediately joined the previous American administration's efforts, hoping to profit from the collapse of our country, reclaim something lost in previous historical periods, and attempt revenge. As has now become obvious to everyone, all these attempts and all these destructive plans against Russia have completely failed. The lesson clearly has not been learned. German Chancellor Merz is plotting a great war and trying to convince everyone, including himself, of the West's strength. 2. Negotiations without an alternative, either this or force. A fundamentally important thesis, repeated in various forms, is the immutability of Russia's goals. They can be achieved either at the negotiating table or by military means. This is not a threat or an ultimatum in the literal sense, but a logical construct that eliminates the very possibility of a compromise that does not meet Moscow's initial demands. In this framework, diplomacy is not an independent value. It is permissible only as a more economical way to achieve the same results. If diplomacy gets in the way or sets conditions that are interpreted as unacceptable, its legitimacy is automatically lost. 3. Europe as a source of peace. Disruption, a separate section of the argument, is devoted to shifting responsibility for the potential failure of the negotiations to Europe. European initiatives, from security guarantees to discussions on troop deployment, are described as inherently unrealistic, provocative, and aimed at disrupting dialogue between Moscow and Washington. It's important to note that Europe isn't simply mistaken in this logic, but is acting deliberately, putting forward demands that Russia cannot accept. This allows for a pre-existing explanation for the impasse. If the negotiations fail, it will be due not to Moscow's rigidity, but to the destructive position of European capitals. 4. The platinum standard as an empty formula. The concept of so-called platinum security guarantees for Ukraine is examined in detail. The logic of the program systematically devalues these guarantees. The absence of American troops on the ground, the lack of ratification in parliaments, and the lack of clarity about the response mechanisms. This establishes a key conclusion. The West itself does not believe in its own guarantees, and therefore cannot demand strategic concessions from Russia in exchange for legally and politically vague promises. This undermines the very basis of a possible deal and reinforces the argument that Western proposals are vacuous. 5. Time as Russia's ally special attention is given to the time perspective. Russia, according to the logic of the episode, is prepared for a protracted conflict and is counting on Ukraine's exhaustion and the West's fatigue. This position is presented not as an acknowledgement of risk, but as a sign of strategic patience and confidence. At the same time, the divergence between the US and European positions is emphasized. Washington allegedly seeks to close the Ukrainian issue, while Europe is prepared to finance the war for years. This divergence is used to reinforce the key thesis. Time is working against the European line and in favor of the Russian strategy.